Mom drained my trust fund for my brother's college after he switched majors thrice, and now she's furious I want to sue her. A few years ago, my biological father passed away, leaving my mom, my older half-brother Kyle, and me to figure things out on our own. His death still feels surreal sometimes, and it has left a deep impact on our family. I'm sure that if my dad were still here, my mom would have never committed this fraud, and things would have been much simpler for all of us. To give you some context, my mom was actually married before I was born. She and her first husband, Vincent, had my older brother, Kyle. While my mom was still married to Vincent, she started working with my dad when she joined the same company. They were co-workers, and from what I've gathered, they didn't have any intentions of starting a relationship at first. But one night, after a work event or something, they got drunk, and one thing led to another. They ended up having a one-night stand, which neither of them expected to turn into anything more. They both assumed they would just go their separate ways after that night and never have to deal with each other again. But life had other plans. My mom ended up getting pregnant with me because of that night. It wasn't something either of them expected or planned for, and as you can imagine, it set off a chain of events that completely changed both of their lives. When my mom's first husband, Vincent, found out about this, their marriage couldn't survive the news, and it fell apart. I'm not sure how exactly things unfolded on my dad's end, but his marriage also came to an end after this. The whole situation was messy and painful, and from what I understand, it was a difficult time for everyone involved. I don't really know why my parents decided to get married after that. I've wondered about it a lot over the years. Was it because they had genuinely fallen in love at some point? Or were they trying to prove to themselves, and maybe to everyone else, that what had happened between them wasn't just a mistake? Maybe they felt pressured to turn their one-night stand into something more meaningful, to justify the upheaval they had caused in their lives. I'll probably never know for sure, but for whatever reason, they chose to get married and build a life together. When I was born, the only people who were there for me were my parents and my older brother, Kyle. Both of my parents' families had essentially cut them off after everything that had happened. They were judged harshly for their affair and the way it tore apart their previous marriages, and unfortunately, I got caught in the crossfire of that judgment. I was just a baby, completely innocent in all of this, but because of the choices my parents made, I was pretty much shunned by my extended family. Both sides, my mom's family and my dad's, didn't want anything to do with us, so that meant I grew up in a world where family gatherings, holidays with relatives, and childhood memories with cousins were all things I never got to experience. The only person close to my age was Kyle. As a result, my older half-brother became a big part of my life. Even though we have different dads, he never treated me differently. Growing up with him was normal to me, though our family dynamics were always a bit unconventional. My parents were always very focused on their careers, so once I started going to school, I quickly learned how to be independent. They were often too busy to be involved in the day-to-day aspects of my life. I had to look after myself for the most part, and my brother Kyle and I essentially raised each other. We grew up on a steady diet of frozen foods because cooking was never a priority in our house. Kyle, being older, naturally took on a protective role at school, always looking out for me, while I did what I could to take care of him in return. We leaned on each other a lot. Initially, Kyle's dad, Vincent, was a huge part of Kyle's life, and every weekend, he would come to take Kyle away with him so they could both spend time together. At first, Vincent didn't want much to do with me. After all, his son was living with the man who had disrupted his marriage, and I was a byproduct of the affair. But over time, Vincent started to see how close Kyle and I were, and to my surprise, he eventually began inviting me along on their weekend trips too. Vincent was the total opposite of my parents. I remember as a kid being struck by how warm and sunny his personality was, especially compared to my mom and dad, who were always so cold and distant. My parents were focused on academics, success, and maintaining their careers. They had little time or patience for anything that didn't fall into those categories. Vincent, though, was different. He didn't care about any of that. With Vincent, it was all about having fun and living in the moment. He would let Kyle and me play in the mud, dance in the rain, and just be kids in ways my parents never did. He would take us out fishing and teach us simple but essential things about life that my parents either overlooked or didn't value. I remember, thinking as a child, how much more alive I felt when it was just Vincent and Kyle. They were the only times I really felt free to just be a kid. My mom, however, never really saw Vincent in a positive light. When Vincent passed away suddenly, she was especially harsh about him during his funeral and mocked him to our faces, telling us how he wasn't successful and ridiculing the fact that he was just a mechanic working in a garage. I think a part of her was just angry that he hadn't left much behind for her or Kyle in terms of money. To be fair, Vincent passed away quite unexpectedly and much too early in his life. I am sure he never had the chance to think about long-term plans or make any financial arrangements for Kyle. After Vincent passed, Kyle became really quiet and withdrawn. He had been so close to his father, and losing him at such a young age was devastating. My brother spent most of his time in his room, avoiding social interactions, and the only person he really talked to was me. During this time, Kyle started spending more and more time playing video games. I think they gave him an escape, a way to block out the pain and the silence that had settled over him after Vincent was gone. But my parents didn't understand that. To them, the video games were just a distraction, something that was keeping him from focusing on his grades and his schoolwork. They only ever saw Kyle's declining grades and would yell at him for hours. They would also ground him, taking away his phone, his laptop, and his gaming station, essentially stripping him of all the things that brought him any comfort at home. I remember thinking how cruel it was that my parents couldn't see what Kyle was going through. They were so obsessed with academic performance and outward success that they didn't realize that my brother was grieving and needed support. Although my parents were often united when it came to punishing Kyle and me if we didn't meet their expectations, their own marriage was falling apart in every other way. Over the years, they had drifted far from each other and were essentially just roommates sharing the same house. They rarely spent any time together and would stay out working late as they could. I don't remember ever seeing my parents hold hands or show any signs of warmth toward one another. Sometimes, they would have nasty fights, especially whenever my dad would come home drunk. He would start these loud, ugly arguments with my mom where he would basically blame my mom for everything that had gone wrong in their lives. My dad would tell her that it was her fault for getting pregnant with me in the first place and breaking up their marriage. My mom, in turn, would argue, telling him that she never needed him and that he could have asked her to abort me instead. I would feel so guilty whenever they fought and would overhear them yelling about this. Hearing that kind of blame thrown around made me feel like my existence was just a burden on their lives. There was so much resentment between them, and they weren't afraid to let it spill out in front of me. It was a vicious cycle where neither of them wanted to be married anymore, yet they both stayed. Despite all the tension and turmoil between them, my parents stayed together until my dad was diagnosed with late-stage cancer. It was devastating news, especially because by the time they discovered it, there was nothing the doctors could do. We all knew that his time was limited, and we were forced to come to terms with the fact that he wouldn't be with us for much longer. It was during this time that my dad began making arrangements for what would happen after he was gone. He drew up a will and made decisions about how his assets would be divided. He left our house to my mom and set up a trust fund that would be shared equally between Kyle and me, ensuring that both of us would be taken care of. My dad, despite all the rocky history, loved both Kyle and me deeply. He saw Kyle as his own son, and that was reflected in how he arranged things for the future. After my dad passed away, we met with the lawyers to go over everything, and they told us that the trust fund contained $500,000. It was a huge relief, a weight lifted off our shoulders because it meant that neither of us would have to worry about paying for college or carrying the burden of student loans ever. That trust fund was a gift that would shape the rest of our lives, and Kyle and I were incredibly grateful for it. Kyle, being the oldest, was the first one to head off to college. My brother has always been talented in so many ways, but if there's one thing that has defined him over the years, it's his indecisiveness. He's always had a hard time sticking to one thing for too long, and that was evident the moment he started college. From the beginning, he couldn't even settle on what major he wanted to pursue. After finally picking one, he barely lasted 2 months before he threw in the towel, complaining to us about how hard it was. What surprised me the most was my mother's reaction. She had always been strict and had high expectations for us, but after Dad's passing, it seemed like something in her had softened, maybe because of grief, or maybe because she was just tired of fighting with us all the time. When Kyle decided to drop his major, instead of pushing back or grounding him as she might have in the past, she simply let it go. She allowed him to change majors. But Kyle was still unsure. Every time he started studying something new according to his choice, he'd quickly get bored or find it too challenging, and end up changing his major again. This cycle repeated itself 3 times in total. Of course, I knew about all this since my brother never hides anything from me. Although I understood that finding the right path can be tough, it was also frustrating to watch my older brother go through this over and over again, especially knowing that the trust fund Dad left was being eaten up by each change. Still, Kyle eventually landed on what he now calls his dream degree, the one he says he was meant to pursue all along. This year is my turn to join college. I have worked hard all throughout high school, and I have been fortunate enough to get accepted into an Ivy League college with a partial scholarship. It is a huge achievement for me since I hadn't even expected it, and feels like a reward for all the effort I have put into my studies over the years. Last week, I sat down with my mom, excited to discuss the details of my upcoming college semester. I was thrilled about getting into an Ivy League school and thought my mom would be proud as well. But from the start, my mom's reaction was off. She didn't congratulate me or seem particularly excited about my acceptance, which was odd, considering what a big deal this was. Then, when I mentioned that I had been awarded a partial scholarship, her eyes lit up with excitement. She immediately asked me how much the scholarship would cover, and once I told her, she seemed almost relieved. She quickly pointed out that between the scholarship and a part-time job, I could pretty much handle my college expenses all on my own. I was confused by this, especially because I had always assumed the trust fund Dad had set up for me and Kyle would take care of my college costs. So I reminded her that I didn't need to get a job because I had my share of the trust fund waiting for me when I turned 18 in just a few months. Plus, with the demanding nature of an Ivy League education, I explained that I really needed to focus 100% on my studies without the distraction of a job. That's when my mom dropped the bombshell. She revealed that the trust fund was pretty much gone. I was completely taken aback, not understanding what she meant. My $250,000 share should still be sitting there, untouched. I couldn't believe what I was hearing, so I asked her to explain. And that's when she started telling me how Kyle had used up all of his portion of the trust fund, first when he changed his major 3 times, and now, with his dream degree, he had been dipping into my share of the money to cover his education. I was in shock. How could this have happened? That money was supposed to be for both of us equally, and it was supposed to be there for me when I started college. I asked her why Kyle had been allowed to use my half of the trust, and she started to claim that she couldn't disappoint Kyle by refusing to pay for his dream degree. She reasoned that he was always the less academically inclined child, so for once, she just wanted to see him become someone successful. I argued that this wasn't fair and that I needed my share of the trust fund, regardless of what Kyle and she wanted. Hearing this, my mom argued back that since Kyle didn't have a scholarship like I did, he clearly needed the money more than I would ever need. She said that if I took the remaining funds, it would affect Kyle's future, and he might even have to give up on his degree midway through. She reasoned that instead of disrupting his career, I could let Kyle have the rest of the money since I had the scholarship to fall back on anyway. I was aghast. It felt like I was being asked to sacrifice my own future for Kyle's. Yes, he's my brother, and I love him, but this was so unfair. I had worked incredibly hard to earn my place at this Ivy League school and to secure that scholarship. I had been responsible with my plans, making sure I could manage without needing more than my share of the trust fund. Meanwhile, Kyle had changed his major 3 times, burning through all his money, and now I was being told to just let him take what was left of mine. My mom's casual attitude about the whole situation also made it even worse. She didn't seem to see the problem. I decided that I needed to talk to Kyle about the situation. He was the only person who could truly understand what I was going through, and I hoped he would provide some clarity on what was happening with the trust fund. When I explained everything to him, he was incredibly surprised. He had no idea that our mom was using my share of the money to pay for his semester fees. After our conversation, Kyle reached out to our mom. He let her know that he recognized it was his fault for changing his major multiple times and that he would take responsibility for it. He offered to either get a job on his own or consider taking out a loan to figure out how to manage his remaining semesters. I was relieved to hear that my brother was willing to take steps to help himself instead of relying on my share of the trust fund. But my mom was furious with me for going to Kyle about this. She accused me of trying to change his mind and influencing him against her when she was doing the best for him since she feels he is the child that needs the most help. Basically, I was blamed for wanting to protect my own future and for encouraging my brother to take responsibility for his choices. I am baffled by her reaction. Am I the a-hole for confronting my brother after finding out that he has been using up my share of the trust fund? Update 1. Thanks to all your suggestions, I asked Kyle to reach out to the lawyer to find out more details about our trust fund. I figured that if we could get access to the bank statements, we would have a clear picture of how much money was left and where it had been going over the years. For anyone wondering, I want to clarify that Kyle is not at fault here. My brother loves me and would never intentionally backstab me in this way. As some of you mentioned, at this point, this whole situation feels very suspicious, and that's why I've been adamant about getting the account statements. My mom's reaction to our discussions only adds to my doubts. I can't shake the feeling that something isn't right, and we have to dig deeper to figure it all out. Meanwhile, my mother has continued to stay angry at me. Today, when I informed her that Kyle would be taking a few days leave from college so he can come back home, and the 3 of us could sit down and have a civilized discussion about this entire situation, her reaction was explosive. She started yelling at me for being so stubborn and unsupportive for refusing to back down. All I want is to clear the air and find a solution that works for all of us. So, I reminded her that I had a rightful claim to my dad's trust fund and it wasn't all for her son only. It was my money too, intended for my education, and I was simply asking for what was meant for me, not for anyone else. My mom then shot back, accusing me of being jealous of Kyle's newfound direction in life, which was very weird since both me and Kyle have never been jealous of each other. I have always supported him, even through his indecision. Her accusation stung, and I felt my frustration bubbling to the surface. In the heat of the moment, I pointed out to her that if she continued to be this difficult, I would have no choice but to hire a lawyer and sue her for my share of the trust fund. The words slipped out before I could fully process their weight. I saw her expression shift, and for a moment, it seemed like my mom was scared. Her face flushed red and she then doubled down to yell at me, telling me that she was my mother and that I needed to respect her. She continued saying that I couldn't just threaten her when I was still living under her roof. Her behavior just seems very, very strange. I am getting more convinced by the minute that my mother has been using my dad's trust fund for something else other than just to pay for my brother's trust fund. I want to avoid any legal action, but if my mother continues to deny my rights to my own share of the trust fund, I will have no choice but to defend myself. Update 2. It's been 2 weeks since I updated anything here. Okay, so Kyle had to take time away from college to come home for a face-to-face conversation with our mom, just like I had mentioned earlier. We knew we needed to address the situation directly, so it felt like the right move to have him come home and talk to her together. Fortunately, Kyle had been emailed the account statements from our lawyer about our trust fund that showed some shocking information. When we both reviewed them initially, it became clear that our mom had been withdrawing large amounts of money from the trust fund every year, right after Dad had passed away and both of us were still in high school. To clarify, she had access to the trust fund and had always managed it. Even after Kyle turned 18 and went to college, he had pretty much let her handle the money because we both thought that we could trust her. This was why he had been completely oblivious to the fact that he was burning through his share of the trust fund. With the bank statements in hand, we confronted our mom. We laid everything out before her and knew that she couldn't keep lying anymore. After a lot of back and forth, she begrudgingly admitted that she had been transferring our funds into her account. Her reasoning? She wanted to retire comfortably, and she had also been using our money to fund her lavish solo trips since Dad passed away. Both Kyle and I were stunned. We had no idea that Mom had been traveling anywhere, let alone enjoying these extravagant trips. We had assumed that any time she was away, it was for work trips only, but it turns out she has been living a secret life. She has been traveling, experiencing new places, and planning to retire early with our money. To add to the shock, she mentioned that she had recently met someone new and was even planning to build a house with her new boyfriend. I felt betrayed and hurt that my mother had not only hidden this from us but had used the funds that were meant for our education for her own personal gains. It was a lot to take in. She claimed that she deserved the money too, arguing that Dad had only left her a house and that she had been responsible for paying the property taxes as well as other things around the house all these years. She insisted that the costs associated with our education were a lot in her eyes, and she deserved some of the money in our trust fund. To be honest, I would not have minded giving her a portion of our money if it meant contributing to the household, but the reality was she had mismanaged our funds behind our backs and had refused to be clear about it until we had to find out on our own. The fact that there was almost nothing left in the trust fund was particularly distressing to me, especially since I was just about to start college. She had made poor choices and it was unfair that we were now left to pick up the pieces. At that moment, I firmly told her, "Mom, I understand that you've been paying property taxes and managing things on your end, but that doesn't excuse the fact that you drained our trust fund for your own desires. This money was meant for our education and our future. I shouldn't have to worry about taking out loans or working part-time because you decided to use it for lavish trips. At least you have agreed to pay for Kyle's education, but you have refused to pay for mine, so I am sorry, but I will be going ahead and suing you." Hearing my words and seeing my serious expression seemed to rattle my mom. She immediately began to backtrack and mention that she could probably cover at least some of my college semesters. However, she reiterated again that I needed to get a part-time job to cover the remaining semesters. Kyle and I both felt the unfairness of her stance. After all, he still didn't have a job, and yet she was somehow expecting me to shoulder this burden alone. When I pointed this out, she quickly tried to reason and guilt-trip me by saying that I was different from Kyle, labeling me as the stronger and more mature kid since my birth. She insisted that I could handle a part-time job along with my studies, unlike him. This was not only frustrating for me but also an insult to Kyle. It felt pointless to keep arguing with her since she refused to budge. At that moment, I came to a conclusion. I had exhausted all my efforts to communicate and reason with her, and needed to take a different approach. As several Redditors had recommended earlier, I have decided to contact a lawyer so I can move forward with the legal action against my mom. My brother understands that this is what I have to do now. Update 3. It's been 5 months since I last updated. I've been really busy with everything and almost forgot to update here. After I made the decision to sue my mom, it affected my family a lot. My mom was furious and would hurl insults at me, calling me arrogant and a gold digger, and accusing me of trying to tear our family apart. Eventually, after my mom's lawyer saw all the evidence against her, they reached out to my lawyer for settlement discussions. My lawyer was confident that we would win this by a landslide since all evidence was stacked against my mom. During the mediation, my mom continued to remain combative. She claimed that she couldn't give me what I wanted and tried to emotionally manipulate me by saying her house could be at risk and that she might have to go into debt just to repay me. However, my lawyer didn't back down and argued back that it wasn't my responsibility to take care of my mother when I was the child in the relationship and that she had no right to take away what was rightfully mine. After much deliberation, my mom, thanks to her lawyer's repeated advice, reluctantly agreed to pay back my entire share of the trust funds. From what I know, she would have to deplete almost all of her life savings, which she basically stole from our trust fund, and will most probably have to keep working at her current job for a very long time to pay me off instead of retiring early like she had planned to. My mom will be transferring the funds directly to my bank account, which she won't be able to access anymore since I am 18 now and it's under my name only. I have to admit that this whole process has been exhausting. It's draining to have to stand up against my own parent. My mom could have handled all of this peacefully before we ever had to involve lawyers. Still, I'm proud that I didn't back down, and I hope my dad would be proud of me too. Throughout all of this, Kyle has stayed in constant contact with me. He feels a lot of guilt regarding both me and mom and is essentially caught in the middle. However, with the outcome of the settlement discussions, he's relieved that I won't have to worry about my college expenses anymore. Update 4. Hello fellow Redditors. I just wanted to come here and quickly share that I'm currently in college. Legally, everything has been resolved with my mom after she paid me back the money she owed. However, personally, we no longer talk to each other, as she still blames me for everything. That's okay, I can live with her disdain. Anyway, I love being on my own for the first time. My brother, Kyle, has been visiting me whenever he can. We continue to stay close despite what we have been through.